Thank you, Stephanie. And so, as she said, my name is Marques Zarate. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department here at Brown. And it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Rodriguez-Muñiz. Professor Rodriguez was born and raised in Chicago. He is an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. And he is part of Berkeley's Latinx and Democracy Cluster and co-director of the Latinx Social Science Pipeline Initiative. He received his PhD from Brown University, his MA from the University of Illinois Chicago, and his BA from Northeastern Illinois University. His research and teaching explore the politics of racial knowledge, primarily in Latinx communities and movements. He is currently engaged in several ongoing solo and collaborative projects, including The Afterlives of Puerto Rican Diaspora Anti-Colonialism and State Repression, The Transformation of Demographic Imaginaries and Contemporary Population Politics, The Racialization of Political Trust, the epistemic and methodological foundations of Du Boisian sociology. In addition, he's actively involved in building a Puerto Rican-focused community archive in Humboldt, Chicago. I got the pleasure to be able to read Professor Rodriguez's book, Figures of the Future. It tells a compelling story about the role of Latinx civil rights advocacy groups in population politics. In his book, he investigates the role of time, quantification of statistics, and emotion that civil rights organizations have used to advance their goal of Latino political incorporation. This book is truly interdisciplinary, as it incorporates elements of sociology, political science, anthropology, the history of American political development. It is fantastically written, and I would urge everyone, not just scholars of Latino studies, to read it. Without further ado, Professor Rodriguez.
So I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, which was here when I was a graduate student, but was certainly not as active as it currently is now. So it seems like a lot of vibrant life that's happening here. I want to thank Stephanie Leroux, Trey Alston Swan, Callum Aldridge for all the work that it took. We tried it took a while to try to make this happen, the pandemic and other things. So I'm glad we were able to make it happen. Many thanks to Marques Zarate for taking the time to, I'm sure, in your first year, to read the book and to engage with me. So I'm grateful for that. I also want to echo Stephanie and acknowledge the original peoples of these lands, the Narragansett Indian tribe, and recognize their inalienable right to these lands, past, present, and future. Like many in the room, I presume I have a heavy heart. Each day brings news of another atrocity against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Death, famine, and destruction have been nonstop for 6 months. And it's disheartening that so many of our academic institutions have not defended anti-genocide students and faculty, and in far too many cases have actually attacked those same students and faculty. So I stand with students and faculty here at Brown and around the world in waging, I think, a beautiful and important struggle to bring an end to genocide, occupation, and colonization. And I just want to voice that I stand in solidarity, in particular with the Brown students, protesters, and urge, along with many colleagues, for the administration to cease its punitive and repressive actions against these students. So now I'll jump into. So what I'm going to try to do with the time, this is going to be more conversational, but to give a kind of overview of some of the key things that I think are in the book. So it's not a book talk per se, but it covers some of that ground. So I have to, as folks mentioned, I got my PhD here. My committee turned out to be half by the time I finished, half Brown and half NYU as a result of one faculty member leaving. But my dissertation was chaired by Jose Itzensong, and Michael Kennedy was on the committee, both in the Department of Sociology. And this book, reflects, much of the time that I spent here and the relationships. And I'll say a little bit about actually the genealogy of this project here in Rhode Island. If you're interested, many years later, after the first hardcover edition in June of this year, there'll be a paperback edition The press probably I'd be happy if I didn't mention that. But if anyone wants paperback, it is coming out very soon. So this project, in many respects, and I narrate this in the preface of the book, a key part of the story of where this project comes from is here in Rhode Island. So as many first-year graduate students have to do, we have to take courses in ethnographic or qualitative methods. And at the time, I was thinking of doing a historical project on the origins of the category Hispanic, where that came from, what the politics were. And fortunately, after just doing a little bit of research and doing a little archival work, a colleague introduced me to the work of Cristina Mora, who's now my colleague, and she was working on her book, Making Hispanics, at the time. And so at the time I'm taking this class at Brown, the 2010 census is happening or about to happen. So the census forms are about to arrive in local communities around the country. And so I thought, it'd be interesting, since I'm not going to do this historical project, is there something I could do related to the census? And I decided that also as a way to get to know the local Latino and Latina community in Rhode Island, that I would do this study about how local leaders were engaging with the census. And as in many communities around the country, there was the formation of what are known as complete count committees. These are volunteer-based formations where local stakeholders, it could be governmental, it can also be nonprofit organizations, independent actors get together, and their effort is to try to get as much of a complete count as possible. And so in 2010, the Rhode Island Latino Complete Count Committee was established, actually a year before the census, so in 2009. So I spent time interviewing and, as much as possible, attending events that this committee was doing to encourage Latinos and immigrants in Rhode Island, specifically Providence and in Central Falls. And so they had I think a really interesting and significant kind of slogan: "Si no nos cuentan, no contamos." If they don't count us, we don't count. And that became the subject of my first, I think, solo authored article, which looks at the work that these organizations were doing. But the reason why I'm mentioning the relationship between this project and what became the book was sparked by conversations and interviews of local leaders who were talking to me about census data in a way that I didn't relate to numbers or statistics. You have to mind, this is the first year taking stats 101. I'm not statistically inclined, and so hearing them talk about data and what the data would show, and the kind of emotional component to them talking about data really made me want to think about what is it about this data that sparks such enthusiasm, excitement, hope. Those are not the affects that I relate to numbers and statistics with. So that really started a series of questions that was in some ways the sort of the genesis for the book project. So I wanted to begin by locating Rhode Island and Providence and the Latino community here. Anyone who has been following U.S. public discourse over the last 20 or 30 years can probably tell some kind of story about ethnoracial demographic change. So at least, beginning in the 1980s, but intensifying with each and every census, there has been this talk that the country's demographic composition is dramatically changing. So this is a 1990 Time magazine cover, America's Changing Colors. And it says, "What will it be like when whites are no longer a majority?" The image itself is suggesting certain kinds of things, the jagged nature of it. But there's been a ton of ink has been spilled. writing about, analyzing, thinking about, prognosticating about what these demographic trends are and what they mean for the country, politically, economically, in terms of identity, the very concept of race, all of these things. So these other headlines are just more recent, so in the last couple of years. And so if one is reading the New York Times or The Economist or you name it, you're going to come across some of these kinds of headlines, such as these are 5 facts that show why demographics are destiny. Can the GOP escape its destiny of demographic disaster? What will America's population look like by 2100? Census shows a nation that resembles its future more than its past. See how demographic swings could impact the 2024 election. America's white majority is aging out. Now, historians will tell us that this is not a new phenomena in the U.S. context, right? Particularly alarmist, racialized discourse about demographics and about quote-unquote problem populations has been part of this settler colonial project from the beginning. You can look in this case, these are images having to do in the early 1920s, Southern and Eastern Europeans. You can look at the discourses around the Chinese Exclusion Act, for instance. And also pretty consistent worries of those that are understood as non-white, eventually sort of assuming numerical superiority. So these demographic discourse and rhetoric is a longstanding feature of U.S. politics and social life. Now, one thing that, as I started to do this research, was significant is that when I said I wanted to do a project about demographics, everyone wanted me to answer what in fact are the demographics. Can you please tell me how many Latinos are there? Or what will the country look like in 2062? So I constantly had to run up against people wanting quote unquote facts about what these demographics are, with far less attention to the politics involved in cultivating how we think of and relate to these kinds of issues. And so the book begins with a comment on what I call demographic naturalism. And so demographic naturalism is a perspective among many that one could take related to demography and demographic populations. So it has a few assumptions that we can see that are prevalent. For instance, if we go back, read these articles, we'll see some of these assumptions kind of in operation. One is the treatment of populations as real, natural, actual entities, objectively existing features of social life, the conflation of populations with peoples or groups, thinking the assumption that a population category and identities are closely linked, right? The other is the treatment of population trends as objective forces. If you look at the literature on population trends, especially if it's as it becomes an object of political rhetoric, they're often described almost as natural forces, floods, swarms, these kinds of things, right? That's presumed to have an effect on social life, whether or not we perceive it in any way. It's just the bare fact of more people is going to impact society. And then finally, there's an assumption around demographic knowledge, which is often treated as a kind of scientific form of knowledge, that it either reflects or approximates demographic realities, right? So that knowledge is just documenting or uncovering what are the facts of demographics. Now, the book rejects these premises and argues instead that we should think of, for instance, demographic knowledge as a kind of political science, wherein politics informs the kind of categories, methods, questions through which we produce statistical categories and statistical knowledge. It suggests that population trends in many cases don't just impact social life kind of objectively, but how they're perceived, right? How people understand those demographic trends, whether they see them as positive developments or dangerous developments. That's not inherent to the numbers themselves, right? There's always a level of interpretation. And similarly, recognizing that populations are not real in a straightforward sense, right? These are statistical aggregates, in some ways simplifications. Doesn't mean that the statistics aren't useful to help us see certain kinds of things, but it's arguing that we need a more complicated understanding and contingent understanding of what populations and what demography is. So to avoid the kind of trap of demographic naturalism, which pervades both media coverage and often social science discourses and discussions around demographic change, the book focuses on what I call population politics. So quickly, population politics refers to deliberate efforts to influence or impose how matters of demography, whether that's population trends, populations, whatever impacts of demographic trends are publicly perceived, felt, and engaged, right? So it comes from the perspective that these trends and these populations, how we perceive them is not related objectively to the size of the population, right? We may very much fear the demographic trends of populations that are numerically small, right? And so population politics are those efforts, often using rhetorical sort of strategies in order to convince relevant publics to think about demographics in a particular way, right? So for instance, white supremacist groups will look at recent census data and will tell a particular kind of story and say that the country is on the verge of losing itself and an apocalypse is coming, right? Again, that's not inherent to those statistics, but it's the kind of political cultural work that they're doing to try to convince certain people to relate to these ethnoracial demographic change in particular as problematic, dangerous, or threatening. Now, there's three ways that we can think of population politics sort of taking place, and I'm just going to quickly mention this. Population politics can take place at the level of creating the data, producing the data. That could be demands for certain kind of categories to be used or certain categories to be removed, right? So it has to do with the creation of demographic knowledge. The politics of circulation have to do with the choices that are involved in circulating or moving and mobilizing demographic knowledge and categories. Again, people are making choices about these things, what to study, but what data to draw on, which data to sort of anchor particular kinds of arguments. And then the politics of representation, and these are certainly related, has to do with rhetoric and discourse. So the way that demographic trends, demographic data, categories are invested with particular forms of meaning. So in the book, I diverge from typical accounts of demographic change. So the book is not about, it's not going to adjudicate what 2050 looks like. It's not going to tell you which of the methods will arrive at the most sound account. And so that's not what it does, right? Instead, the book is interested in present political struggles over how demographic futures are envisioned, sensed, and acted upon. And if folks are interested, I'm happy to talk about other ways that social sciences have tried to think about the relationship between politics and demography, such as political demography and demographic engineering. So in addition to this shift to reject this idea of, the bare facts of demographic change, let's say, there is literature that has tried to look and analyze demographic discourse and demographic sentiments. Now, with very, very few exceptions, that literature has focused primarily on dominant groups in Europe, or particularly Western Europe, and in the United States, how they relate to these demographic trends. So, for instance, how those racialized as white relate to these demographic trends, or how right-wing movements have mobilized certain kinds of ideas about demographic change to affect politics in the present, right? So we have a bunch of books that have come out since the Trump period that are telling this story about one of the features of the Trump project is, leveraging these ideas about this demographic apocalypse. And so Figures of the Future tells a different story. It foregrounds instead minoritized groups that are also engaged in this kind of population politics. But in this case, they're not attempting to cultivate fear or worry or anxiety about demographic trends. They're attempting to, in some cases, encourage a sense of hope about what demographic trends portend, but also to do so in a way to support civil rights efforts or broader claims for equality. So as a case study, I chose national Latino civil rights organizations. These are all pretty mainstream organizations that are based or do advocacy and lobbying in and around Washington, D.C. These are groups like the National Council of La Raza, which today is Unidos US, Voto Latino, which has often targets kind of like celebrities and millennial Latinx and Gen Z. The older organizations like the League of United Latin American Citizens, these are some of the lobbying events. This is their public policy agenda. So these organizations are particularly good to explore population politics, especially those emanating from minoritized groups, because this network is actively involved in trying to communicate and cultivate to the public, to elected officials, certain ideas about what Latino population growth means, right? That it's good, it's beneficial for the country, that you have to listen to the Latino community in part because of its demographic trends. So these are just some of the sort of slogans and things. Work to get people to participate in the census, claims that 50,000 Latinos turn 18 every month in the United States, described as a fact. Growth of the U.S. Hispanic population shows the future is Latino. So all of this like cultural work and political work that they're doing, these organizations. And in the book, I kind of tell a story of how these organizations, particularly in the post-civil rights period, or in the heat of the civil rights period, and in the post-civil rights period, population politics became, in some sense, hardwired to the kind of advocacy, the kind of rhetoric that they use, right? So it's common for them to invoke these things. There is some shifts that have happened more since the Trump period that have disrupted this a little bit. So they're a pretty excellent case to explore population politics, again, not from the perspective of nativists or white supremacist groups, but from minoritized groups that are trying to leverage demographic trends as a kind of resource. And I just have a couple more slides. So the book details, and we can talk more about this, it argues or it uncovers through I should have said, the research entailed ethnographic work in Washington, D.C., and in various other locations, Orlando, and attending national gatherings of these organizations, as well as interviews and collecting both media and products and reports that they either produced or consume, and sort of bringing to bear those three forms of data. So what the analysis revealed is that these actors have, at least in the period that I was focused on, which is sort of between the Obama presidency and the first few years of the Trump period, is that they engage population politics through the three forms of temporal tactics. And temporal tactics are projects, techniques, discourses that are deployed to shape how people and publics experience time, like the passage of time, as well as how they perceive time, imaginaries, what they consider the past, what they consider the future, the meanings that they associate with past and present and future, whether they think that future is coming faster or slower. These organizations use 3 temporal tactics as part of their population politics. And I describe them as forecasting, foreshadowing, and forewarning. There's a chapter dedicated to each of these that looks at a particular moment and the way that they sort of engage in these tactics. So just to wrap up, I'm not going to get into the sort of, we can get into more of the minutia of the book, but I just want to give a kind of like overview of some of the broader aspects of it. So a couple implications. First and foremost, what the book does is it demonstrates the institutionalized centrality of population politics to mainstream Latino civil rights politics, right? It's like one of the key tactics and strategies that these organizations engage in as part of their efforts to grow what they consider Latino political power. The second has to do with the relationality of imagined futures and temporal tactics. So I talk about the ways that Latino civil rights advocates do not invoke a kind of Latino future in a vacuum, but often it's calibrated against their anticipation of white supremacist discourses and attempting to engage and sort of minimize the kind of blowback. So like not talking about the browning of America, not using language like demographic takeover, those kinds of things, right? So the articulations of demographic projections and futures don't happen in isolation, right? There's a dialogue, debate, struggle between different perspectives. One aspect that I didn't develop, is that there's room to explore how temporal tactics that are future-oriented relate or are different from more commonly studied temporal tactics that deal with the past. Like narratives about the past, invented traditions, those kinds of things is something that I'm interested in looking at the relationship between how we talk about the future, we narrate the future, and what that says or doesn't say about how we're naming or not naming, characterizing how we perceive the past and present. And then the last, I think, contribution of the book is just sort of reorienting or providing an alternative to the kind of scholarly sort of debate about what will these ethnoracial demographic trends, in fact, generate in the country. And what it suggests is, rather than only sort of project into the future what we think those things will be, it's to recognize that our scholars as well as activists are engaged in this population politics effort. And so rather than talk about, let's say, the browning of America, it suggests that we think of the browning of America, it doesn't reflect, it's not an outcome of the data itself. It's these political struggles. And so it invites us to take seriously, the quantification of race and ethnicity, to think about the political conflicts and struggles through which we arrive at a sense that the country is demographically changing in racially profound ways, right? That has more to do with these political struggles and their histories rather than the complexion of the populations that we perceive as growing or declining. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. So I think I wanted to proceed. I have some prepared questions that are kind of in the somewhat based off of the order of your book. But, if the conversation takes us one way, we can just kind of go from there. So I guess I kind of wanted to start off with the introduction. You kind of introduced this analytic scaffolding, which includes the temporality, quantification, and emotional aspects of it. And so to start, I just want to talk about the ideas of times and emotions in particular and kind of how it's interwoven throughout. And so what I love is just how clear these themes are within like contemporary politics today. So if you're looking at like among the Latino population, there is this enthusiasm for the future of the group that's very prevalent within these civil rights organizations. But then you look at among non-Latinos, and there's this anxiety about what future can bring, and that's where you kind of get a lot of these of "Make America Great Again" and some of these other kind of things that we're seeing today. And I think it's very similar to like this, what you're talking about, the book called like White Demographobia, or like also demographic linked fate, how like the future is going to be interwoven for each of them. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of came to adopt this scaffolding. Like, did you have this framework in mind at the beginning of your research, or was it something that became clear kind of like as you progressed through it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly didn't have a scaffold when I started. As anybody who's written a dissertation prospectus, you have to do some work, right, to kind of figure out how you're going to be framing it and what literatures are you in conversation with and what tools are you drawing for your analysis. So in that process, there was some literature that I had come in contact with. I started thinking a lot about projections about the future, and at that point, I was just looking around to see, all right, what's that conversation? Is there a sociology of the future? And if so, what does that look like? What kind of resource? And fortunately, I came across a few works that had been written. There's a UK kind of sociology of the future. There's also a mid-20th century sociology of the future. But I was interested in whether or not there was a contemporary conversation thinking about the future. And fortunately, there was. And so that provided me with one kind of anchor, which became a key part of the scaffold that I describe in the book. The other area, which I was somewhat more familiar with, had to do with recent work on the sociology of quantification. It's more interdisciplinary than that. Some of that comes out of science and technology studies, but it's basically efforts to, again, denaturalize how we relate to numbers and statistics more generally. Right, from censuses to ledgers to you name it, and so there was a growing body of work that was attentive to those things, and so I started swimming in those waters because, as I mentioned before, the project was about the census, and typically the way we relate to census is we focus on categorization, like what are the categories at play, but we spend far less time thinking about what happens when you count based on those categories, when you aggregate by them, when you develop tables and infographics and those kinds of things that our sort of shared universes is saturated with. And so that literature helped. The question of emotion I knew that emotion mattered because you look at these discourses of demographic, the Great Replacement and all of this like alarmist discourses. They're charged with, and you can tell that they're trying to get people to feel a certain way about these trends. And so it seemed to me that it was important to have emotion not just kind of be in the back burner. So the project kind of created a kind of triangle of sociology of the future, sociology of quantification, and work not just in sociology, but on emotion and affect. All of them oriented to questions of politics and race and racial projects and things like that.
Yeah, great. And I think that actually kind of touches on my next question perfectly. And so I kind of want to talk about quantification. And one thing I was wondering is like, can you have like this temporality, like these emotional aspects without the quantification of it? Like, do people need these quote unquote like objective numbers in order to kind of use it as a tool? Or like, yeah, I guess, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, if, so the demographic data became widely available, in the early to mid 19th century. Mm-hmm. We have traces of demographic discourse and fear that precedes that, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't, and there's other forms of projection that don't require, think about, discourses about the end times. They don't require statistics to have an emotive, potential to them. Mm-hmm. So Yeah, so you don't need you can certainly narrate and engage in population politics around demographics without anchoring numbers. But since demographics and statistics today, we think demography numerically and statistically now. In practice, they're closely linked, but
Mhm.
there's certainly early forms of demographic fear didn't have resource. I mean, there's interesting work that's emerging both in the humanities that's actually looking at demographic fear in novels and in 17th century, 18th century, particularly as cities were growing and sort of fear about the city mob and overdensity and things like that. But they didn't have resources of like statistics. They weren't statistical tables, but there was some kind of proto ideas of population and demography that were in play.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I guess you also brought up the past, which was the first section of your book, so it kind of leads into the next one that I want to talk about. So still kind of like on this idea of quantification. So you talk about the history of these Latino civil rights groups and their push to have Latinos be counted and counted accurately. It was fascinating. I learned a lot through the book. I really did enjoy reading it. Since the publishing of your book, the OMB recently decided that they would move forward with the combined question for race and ethnicity. So what struck me was how you mentioned many of these groups were initially opposed to the question format. And you kind of also talked about like back in the 1930s when they got the Mexican American question added and they're going to make that separate from the white. They pushed back saying like, oh, we want this white category. And so I was wondering if you could maybe kind of talk about like how these civil rights groups had initially thought about that before eventually they went on board with, you mentioned like Christina Mora and having this combined question. Yeah, did they talk about that, like the justification for wanting to have it separate at first, or how did that process kind of change?
Yeah, and thanks for raising that. The first, just to give folks the first chapter, I think is a really significant one. It is a kind of like historical background, but I actually think, and I try to suggest that I kind of emphasize these three moments that sedimented certain ideas around demographic change, and the first one is around sort of like white demo dystopias, which is a concept from a Spanish demographer. But the third section, which is the more immediate concern for the book, is the origins of these civil rights organizations and asking the question, like, why did these organizations in the first place come to emphasize talking in terms of demography and statistics, right? That's not obvious. Other groups did not think about that. If you look at early League of United Latin American Citizens, the Young Lords, the farm workers movement, they weren't engaged in population politics to make claims, right? Social movements don't always or often use demography in those ways. So it's worth trying to historicize why did this political project, adopt this kind of strategy. So I tell part of that story. Thankfully, Christina Mora's book has been really helpful in that front. Is that period of the 1960s and 70s where the category Hispanic came and these civil rights organizations started making these demands for data, right? And building on Christina, she finds, and I found the same thing as I went through some of the archival records, these 1960s. I mean, this is the period of some of these civil rights legislations are passing. There's suddenly like new resources and opportunities. And then these particularly Mexican American leaders are like, we can't access very much. We have no documentation of how large the population is, how many Chicano students are graduating from school. We can't do that. We just don't know, So there's this huge gap of knowledge, and they start seeing that gap of knowledge as the reason why they are more or less invisible in their terms in the national discourse. So national discourse on race and inequality, Chicanos and at that point Spanish-speaking populations were considered regional issues, Southwest, maybe the Northeast, New York, but they weren't seen as national issues. And so it's in this moment where they start thinking that the creation of data and statistics and new categories is going to be central to the civil rights project. And they start making an argument that, statistical invisibility is a violation of civil rights, and that having statistical visibility, being part of the governmental data infrastructure, is a site of of equality. Like, to get equality, you have to have those things, but it's a civil rights issue, right? Data production. And so they went in not necessarily with a clear sense of, we want an ethnic category or we want a racial category or those kinds of things. They went in trying to just get a category in. And in that process, they're impacted by both what happened in 1930 that you mentioned, which is that the federal government, for just one census, makes Mexican a racial category. And that was in part to begin monitoring people crossing the border. This is the moment when the U.S.-Mexico border is especially becoming kind of politicized, and the borders being set up, and all of these kinds of things. People prior to that kind of walked back. It went across pretty easily. So the drama that generated, the Census Bureau and local leaders were also like, oh, we're not necessarily calling for like a racial category, and so through negotiations with the Census Bureau, with the Office of Management and Budget, with the various administrations, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, the addition of Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans into the mix of trying to get some statistical representation, ultimately, generates what became the Hispanic category, and a compromise that would be that there would be a Hispanic origin question and a race question. And that was meant to satisfy various constituencies. One were statisticians who thought that in combining those questions would kind of mess up their ability to compare census data across censuses. It also allowed Census Bureau and advocates to stay on good terms with Black activists and Indigenous activists who were concerned that bringing the category Hispanic into the race category might lower the numbers for those other populations. So it's very delicate. There's the moment where undercounts are becoming politicized, and they're very tied to resources. And so Hispanic as a separate question, which now people sort of talk about as resting on some kind of ontological fact that these are separate things, actually was like a very negotiated outcome to keep the peace, but still create like an avenue where this set of advocates could get some statistical visibility. So that's a long, the chapter goes beyond that to tell the story of how the demand for data was initially to document disparities, and then it became demands for data to project the future. And those are also different uses of statistical data, but they're linked in these organizations.
Awesome. Yeah, I found it really interesting, kind of like when you're talking about how like the Mexican, Puerto Rican, like Cuban advocates didn't really like advocate for like having an encompassing term. And like in a lot of ways, like I think that was a moment where there was like a Latino identity created to a certain extent. Because like one thing that's always fascinated about me is like until you immigrate to the United States, you aren't Latina. Like you're Mexican, Puerto Rican, El Salvadorian, so on and so forth. You're not Latina until you come into the United States. But at the same time, like a lot of people kind of crave that type of identity. So I kind of remember some like work by historians that like after the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, where like the new treaty citizens would often try to emphasize their Spanish ancestry and try to claim like their whiteness, but it was oftentimes rejected. So there was this almost like desire for an identity. So I was wondering kind of like, yeah, I guess to what extent do you believe that this original Hispanic Latina categorization that kind of came about like in the 60s and 70s influenced the creation of a pan-ethnic identity? Like, was that the onus of it, or could you talk a little about that?
I think that is one part of it. right? I think you're right that the leaders didn't go in with a kind of pan-ethnic vision initially, right? That the Chicanos and Mexican Americans were very fine having a Mexican American category, right? They were not there at the onset, right, looking for this encompassing thing. It became clear to them in their negotiations with the powers that be that separate categories for these various populations wasn't going to be the way to go, right? But at the same time, there was also a period of some growing consciousness and collaboration across these folks. So whether that's in party politics or in the emerging kind of like Latino subset of kind of Capitol Hill, now they're interfacing with each other. Like Puerto Ricans from New York, Mexicans from the Southwest, and Cubans. They're in the halls of Congress, like trying to do stuff together. So there is, I think, another part of the story is they're starting to build these ties and relationships while they're getting pressures to develop these sort of big categories. This is also taking place at a moment in which the federal government realizes or decides that it needs to standardize ethnoracial categories. Right? Prior to that, departments could have whatever set of taxonomies they wanted. And that with civil rights legislation, then it's like, wait a second, how are we going to enforce civil rights legislations if, the Department of Housing and Department of Labor have different ways of classifying by race, ethnicity, and all these kinds of things. And so there's a big push in this same period to standardize, to simplify. So as they're making these demands, there's these other sort of broader institutional pressures to simplify. Now, to your question about I think certainly the category has contributed to I would say the Latinization of these populations, the pan-ethnicization of them for sure. I think there's a way we sometimes tell the story, and it always begins with the census. And then it's like it's only the census, or that's the source of it. When at the same time that this stuff is happening, you're seeing the development of what could be a kind of Latino identity. You could read like Felix Padilla's work, Latinismo in Chicago, looking at Mexican and Puerto Rican sort of development of a kind of shared political project that is related to the civil rights period, but not through census data, right? Mm-hmm. Or the work of anthropologists that have looked at the way that Latino identity and pan-ethnic arises from shared community space, like Hispanas from Queens and stuff like that. So there is a way that like the census and the 1980 introduction of Hispanic and the way that it became popularized and institutionalized in government and other spaces is treated as like the thing that generated this sense of pan-ethnic belonging or this we-ness, when there's various sort of inroads in addition to older trajectories like the formation of leftist radical movements in like New York City in the 1920s and 30s that were sort of pan-Latino in vision, right? There's also those currents that we don't talk about, but it's, I think, a key part for sure.
Yeah. I have a couple other questions on identity later, but I think now I kind of want to move on to the second section of your book that was about the future and kind of like how these different civil rights organizations utilize this quantification and the census data. And so in this section, you kind of go through, you argue that the civil rights organizations engage in the practices of what you called foreshadowing, forecasting, and forewarning. And so throughout the book, you collected a ton of data in the forms of interviews, participant observation, and primary materials. So I guess to start off, I was just very curious to are there any particular pieces of evidence that just really stand out to you? Like when you think back, like, oh, this was like really cool. And that maybe help illustrate these three practices, or there's one that you just think are cool?
Yeah. I think forecasting, which I just mentioned over here, has to do with, in some ways, that's just like telling the story about what the future will hold. It can have a positive, negative valence. It can be ambivalent, whatever, but it's kind of like telling that story. That one kind of came to me, at first I didn't have these three terms, that came much later. And I don't even know if they're really fleshed out in the dissertation, actually, now that I think about it. I knew different things were happening in these, because the book is also told chronologically. Um, so that one, it was more the abundance of their talk about the future after the 2010 census came out. That was like, oh, okay, they're actually like, they're really painting a picture of what these trends mean. And they're doing so, one thing that was kind of, I think was significant for me is hearing from them how deliberate it was, because they're anticipating nativist backlash. So they're like, the census data is going to come out in a few weeks. If we're not prepared, Fox News and, Rush Limbaugh and others, they're going to drive home that like Latinos are taking over. It's going to be California, like it's, the worst possible, California is like seen as on the right as basically the worst thing that could happen to the rest of the country. And so hearing them talk about how deliberate it was to try to craft these stories, I think was significant for me. Because at first I was just seeing the products of that rather than being able to hear like, oh, so what did you do to like generate that thing? For the others, I think it was, one of them that was really significant that's in the book, and I think I used it in the slide, was this this figure of 50,000 Latinos turn 18 every month, right? And when we look at the forecasting tends to be pretty long term, like what's going to happen 2050, 2060, 27, by the century's end, right? It's like that long length. And then you have this like figure that's like every month, 50,000 Latinos turn 18. It's a curious one because like every month, more white voters turn 18, right, than 50,000. But nonetheless, that figure really was like still used, hyper mobilized. And so that helped me. That's like it has a different temporal reach, right? One is many years from now. This one doesn't have like an endpoint, but it's very like pressing. Like right now, this is happening. And so that was one of the things that made me think, well, this is different from forecasting. This is foreshadowing. And what foreshadowing is supposed to capture is claims that the future is not in the future, but it's already here. So it's like it's drawing on things that are currently happening to say that the future is either here or just around the corner, as opposed to forecasting, which could be pretty like long-term kind of thing. And then the last one, which is forewarning, was really used most explicitly after the 2012 election, when they claimed, look, we proved, like we told you that this Latino power was already here, and look how the election turned out, and Obama was reelected. Latinos were a key constituency for that. And then they start saying to the Republicans, like, if you don't pass immigration reform, you're shit out of luck, because you already know what the future holds. So then the forecast takes a turn to say, like, you have some agency here. Like, your political future is, and there's a cartoon, like they would be extinct like the dinosaur, right? This language of extinction. And so they're like, you have a chance to avoid that meteor, if you pass immigration. We all know that didn't happen. The book, tells that story too. But that one, it was just how strident they were after the election. And like we're coming for you. That made me think, well, this is a different way of invoking the future. It felt different. It was communicated differently. And that was especially evident in early press conferences. So some of it is stuff that they produce, like graphics with numbers. Others is like the tone of their press releases and their press conferences that suggested these are different things they're doing different kind of work. And that's ultimately, and I wanted it to be consistent. I was looking for 4 something. I wanted 3 or 4, Yeah.
No, I found it really interesting. Like especially on the topic of forewarning. So you mentioned particularly after 2012, these organizations were using forewarning to really advance their agenda, in particular in immigration reform. That seemed to be the most pressing matter for them at that time. And then you kind of go on later on in the book to kind of like, so to much of their chagrin, and despite, his white nationalist and anti-immigrant language, Donald Trump secured about 30% of the Latino vote in 2016. And in 2020,
I guess it's debated.
yeah,
a high amount nonetheless.
it was a very high amount. But even then in 2020, there was again, if we can debate the numbers, but like there's an additional 8-point swing towards Trump. And so to what extent do you believe that forewarning didn't necessarily work as anticipated, because it kind of hinged on this idea of like a cohesive Latino electorate, which I've always kind of questioned in the first place as to, but then B, that's primarily on immigration reform. And so I'm always kind of thinking, like, when you kind of bowl Latinos, like, and we can, divide it by subgroup, like immigration isn't necessarily the number one issue on their list. It's always healthcare, education, and yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, I guess like to what extent do you think like forewarning didn't work because it A, hinged on a cohesive Latino electorate, and B, they primarily relied on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, those are excellent. I mean, I think the assumption of a cohesive Latinx population, I think it's a big assumption that not just the Latinx folks, but the Democratic Party kind of took for granted. I think a couple of things happen in this moment. One is that, as I mentioned in the book, that their narrative about like this, like Latinos decided the election, right? Which the newspaper said and all of this stuff. Then the census releases like voter data about 6 or 7 months later, and the picture doesn't look as powerful. And then at the same time, you have a set of the Republican Party that is beginning. There was that moment where everybody said, oh, we need immigration reform. It was like everybody did an about face. But there were some folks in the Republican Party who were saying, I don't think we need to do that. They did their own calculus. They said, we don't need all of Latinos. We don't need all of African Americans. We don't need all of Asians. We need a subset of those populations to offset, our demographic decline of Republican white voters. And that's enough to, get the presidency, right? So that's all we need to do. And so we don't need to start giving away immigration reform or other big ticket items. We actually just have to play the game differently and recognize that all hope is not lost. And then, of course, Trump comes and validates that idea to some extent, especially with the numbers of Latinos, which itself wasn't surprising. Like political scientists and folks that listen to Latino politics knew that there is a constituency that's very longstanding and consistently votes Republican, at least around 20% of the Latino electorate. So whether Trump got 20, 25, or 30 is not like out of the blue. Now, what happened here, which I think is significant, and I would put a lot of onus on the Democratic Party in 2016, is that they were convinced that Trump's rhetoric against Latinos and Mexicans in particular would translate into a hypermobilization of that population. Mm. And so rather than investing more in outreach and voter mobilization, they actually invested less than they did in 2012. Right? So I would talk to these advocates who are trying to get the vote out and are doing so with a ton less money, because they assumed, oh, Trump said all this stuff about Mexicans and immigrants. Watch, he's going to get them. But that's not how politics works. You still have to mobilize. You still have to organize. You still have to invest. So I think more than Trump capitalized on that vacuum and tapped into that older sort of conservative that like Jerry Cadava has really recently written a book about. But I think the story has to be in the party politics context as well, which we often, these leaders get pissed off because they're like, oh, you didn't mobilize the Latino vote. It's like, well, you can't with insufficient resources, places where the Democratic Party is as or more an obstacle to Latinx political representation than the Republicans. That's what Florida. Florida Republican, they were like, oh, Republicans in Florida will prop up some Latino names to run for offices, and people see that and they're like, oh, there's representation, but not Democrats. But then when the national election comes, they're like, oh, we want you to be, we want you to be loyal to the Democratic Party without investments, without a commitment to representation. So I think there's a few factors that went into that dynamic. They certainly, the Latino advocates played into some of them, but they were also caught by, I think, some longstanding institutional, organizational, and financial factors that led to that situation.
Yeah, I forget what year it was, but I think they poured the Democrat Party poured $0 into Florida. They're we just give up at one point. But kind of on this idea of the party politics and also the type of issues that the civil rights advocacy groups and the Democrat Party is advocating for. One frustration that I have, and I feel there is also somewhat of this tension within your book, is, and so in one of the chapters you start off, I want to say it was an ad by Unidos US where they're kind of saying yeah, it's kind of Latinos of the future, we are American. But oftentimes they only, at least the Democrat Party only really appeals to Latinos in the context of immigration. Otherwise, I feel it's often just a general appeal, right? And so if we're trying to tell a story that we're more than immigrants, then I guess how does that play out? Are these conversations that were being had within these civil rights organizations, or?
Yeah, I mean, they are not just concerned with immigration. They have it's now seems kind of defunct, which is disappointing, because during this period, the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, which is a coalition of about 30 of these kinds of organizations, really started kind of asserting itself under the leadership of Hector Sanchez. And it started becoming actually visible entity. And so they release a public policy agenda. They used to every 2 to 4 years. And immigration is just one of the things, right? There's everything from voting rights to increasingly they brought criminal justice, economic development, housing, all kinds of things. And they'd be the first to tell you that Latinos are not a monolith with respect to policy concerns and issues, or even party affiliation. They'll say that, they love saying that it's heterogeneous, but sometimes not in practice, sort of abiding by that. I think the emphasis on immigration was the sense that they had 2012, I think there was just such a strong sense that they could win, and they had been one of they had been part of a constituency that had actually created some tensions with the Dreamers, because the Dreamers were let's pass this Dream Act just for the Dreamers. And then these organizations, most of them, except for the Mexican Legal Defense, MELDEF, had said, no, we need comprehensive immigration reform. But we need the whole thing, right? And they didn't get the whole thing, and they didn't get the Dream Act, right? And so there was a big tension there. So I think they saw this as that the door was open for immigration. Also, there's other things that they were doing that I wasn't following as closely. They were, every time there's a new person elected, when Obama went into his second term, there was the push to have proportional representation in the cabinet, right? So that was also a big push, something that they regularly do. So they were doing other kinds of stuff, but immigration did that year in particular, was the bulk. And there's a conviction among them that even though Latinos have a lot of issues, immigration is the most unifying at the kind of gut or heart level. Which, may be true, but for Puerto Ricans, for instance, it's, not maybe quite the same.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it makes sense that after 2012, after having just secured a Democrat president, that would be the time. I guess I'm always just kind of curious, like how the party learns from these civil rights organizations, insofar as like if that is the main thing they're pushing, like is that what they just kind of assume that's what Latinos want? Because there is one thing that we've learned, like in political science, is that we do have all this polling data, but politicians often aren't able to actually capture like what the population wants. Right. And so if it's these organizations that are doing the main messaging, I just want to know, like, since you're like in a lot of these rooms, if that is what they're doing.
I mean, that's a good question. Like what the I wasn't in a lot of the rooms where they were, these are technically nonpartisan organizations. Yeah. And so I wasn't in any partisan spaces with them. But you're right. I mean, there is messages that they're sending, right, about what are the priorities. It's not by accident that when Obama was trying to get this, reelected, after a lot of pushing and him saying it's not possible to do anything, then he issues DACA, So like he chose that over other things, thinking that could have some impact on Latino voters. And so that's, at least to some extent, I think I would imagine that these advocacy groups help, so like, all right, this could really make a difference. But you're right. And sometimes can reinforce a kind of like monolithic perspective where then you have to pander to a heterogeneous population on the base of one or two issues, like you're perceived that way. So they might actually be contributing to while trying to like diversify the issues and needs, their focus might actually be reinforcing a kind of narrowing.
Yeah, awesome.
Good point.
Yeah, so I guess moving on a little bit. So in section 3 of your book, and you also mentioned it right now, you talk about representation, but you talk about the Latino Power Project and like towards the end of your book, and a group with the goal of increasing Latino representation. And so kind of considering the ideological diversity of Latinas and your time spent with these other Latina civil rights organizations, what advice would you give them or the other civil rights organizations on planning for the future? I know you don't talk about like you want to predict it, but if you're trying to make a strategy going forward, like what would you tell them?
That's a good one. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, when you study politics and your politics are different from the people you study, it's an interesting tension. I think, this is not like a plan, but these organizations, and there's variation between them, are largely, like these large legacy civil rights organizations who have tenuous, if at best, ties to local populations, and local communities. LULAC has councils, so they have some of that, but others far less so. Some of them are, this is an idea that I didn't pursue, but is interesting, which is the role of big corporations in bankrolling these civil rights groups. Like I'll attend an event on like civil rights and it's like sponsored by Walmart or something, And actually people brought up, sometimes in the organization themselves and sometimes actually elected officials, saying, you have this campaign against voter suppression, but the person who's founding you is like funding all of the voter suppression like bills, right? So there's certainly this like the kind of corporatization of not just Latino civil rights, but like U.S. civil rights advocacy politics writ large that is, I think, an issue that I think I would encourage them to sort of assess that. I also think that it would be helpful to, I don't know. The easiest thing for me is these are mainstream organizations who more or less want to do insider politics. And there's a place for that, I think. But the Trump moment kind of revealed the limits of that. At moments where the community and even some people within the organizations were saying, no, we actually need to do more direct action. We need to be, it was very difficult for them, Someone said, one of the leaders described his colleagues as like indoor cats that have had themselves declawed. Like they've been living well so long they don't know how to like take it to the streets and stuff. I know that's not the solution for everything, but I think it's a kind of advocacy in DC, Latino otherwise, is kind of like in a bubble. And so I think alternative ways of thinking, politics, imaginaries, possibilities, linkages, is like takes place in the bubble. And the last point is Latino civil rights politics is also super domestic. Like unlike some Asian American organizing that may have some like concern with like U.S. foreign policy, Latino politics, as part of an effort to project a sense that we are American, has a hyper domestic perspective, and so misses opportunities to make connections with social movements or interesting kind of like politics and party formations happening, for instance, in Latin America. Like there's no connections. So anyway, those are some places where I would encourage some reflection.
No, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I skipped over a question that you kind of like talked about a little bit. And so like in the later chapters of your book, you provide some quotes from people like in meetings, like in the wake of the 2016 election, when they wanted a lot more action, a more activist approach. And a lot of these quotes were kind of saying like, this isn't what the community wants, this isn't what their interests are. And like you kind of talk about them in a bubble, and like I kept on thinking to myself like, well, what are they doing to try to understand the community, and like what ultimately is the goal? Because like I think representation is a lot of a goal. And so like one thing I kind of think about is the former congresswoman from Texas, like Mata Flores, who kind of like says like these are Latina politics, right? And so one of the final questions I kind of had you wanted to ask you is based off of Cristina Beltran's work, which is something that you incorporate a lot throughout your book, but particularly in the conclusion, you seem to almost question the legitimacy of a Latina identity in the context of politics. And so one thing I appreciated while reading the book was your incorporation of Christina's work on the trouble of unity. And so in her conclusion, she writes that, and this is a quote, presumptions of shared political consciousness are continually challenged by the reality of Latina ideological diversity. And so like I've kind of always contended, like the Latino population is dynamic and ever changing. And also the ways in which they might come into the country is different. And so you could immigrate the quote unquote right way, or you could be coming from an asylum camp, and all these different experiences are going to contribute to a different type of ideology in general. And so I guess the one question I had for you is, as someone who does, I guess, quantitative Latino politics and identity, but also in general, like what advice would you give to those interested in studying Latino politics and trying to understand, like, I guess, when it does make sense and when it doesn't?
Yeah, that's a big. I didn't want the book to be like an indictment on pan-ethnic politics or the possibility of something like a pan-Latinx politics emerging. Any of these like large scale like categories are always fraught, right? Like they always come with historical erasures and silences, right? This period, for instance, was the period in the 2000s where like thinking about Afro-Latinidad sort of like surfaced in some of these organizations in different ways, try to engage with that, but often it was kind of like in a pure symbolic way, like who's going to be on the cover of the report, as someone who's maybe a little darker skinned than the folks that they may have picked in the past. So, I mean, I think that for politics and for analysts, I think we have to have a level, like we have to be. I mean, I think we need to be mindful, right, that these are fraught categories that are contingent, that are meaningful in contingent ways, that have histories, that have politics, whether one is doing an ethnography or quantitative study using these labels, right? I think we have to relate to them, recognizing that they're unsettled and what Latinidad means in New York right now in a particular body is very different from what it does in Chicago and Humboldt Park, and the way that people invoke it. And I think quant and qualitative work easily falls into a kind of like realism and naturalism around these categories. And it's not unique to the category Latino or Hispanic. Any of the ethnoracial categories, we use them in such a way where we just dehistoricize them, where we're inattentive to the internal like fissures and struggles, the politics, the histories, and we kind of like use them as self-evident and presume that there's a direct, necessary, always already correspondence between a category and how people see themselves and the projects, you know. And I think we have to relate to them with some degree of you know, some caution and some vigilance, I think. And I think it'll probably manifest itself differently depending on methods and how we're using them. But I think across the approaches, we have to engage these categories with care, I think, while simultaneously, I think, also retaining a recognition of the deep like investments that people may have with them, right? And I wanted to be careful, like even with these Latinx organizations, like I have my concerns and reservations about some of the politics, but I also wanted to write it in such a way, hopefully most of it, that would honor some of their investments, right? Like people are convinced that this is a track where they can make change. I may not necessarily agree at all times, but people are attempting to do something. And so how do you critique and at the same time acknowledge? And so I don't want to also relate to Latinx folks anywhere as being like, oh, they don't know what's up, or they're just engaged in popular reifications. I think we could analyze that, but I think also appreciating like why people come to embrace certain kinds of labels and categories in profound ways. You know, I think that matters too, while we historicize and situate and all of that stuff.